You cannot keep her here. The cavalry captain's voice cracked like a whip across the morning air, his blue uniform dust-covered and sweat-stained from the hard ride. That woman belongs with her own kind. The Apache warrior standing before him remained motionless as carved stone, dark eyes reflecting nothing but cold determination. Behind him, the gentle curve of a woman's belly showed beneath buckskin, and her pale hand rested protectively over the life growing within. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. She stays. 2 words, spoken in English thick with accent, but carrying the weight of mountains. The captain's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm. I have orders. You have death. The warrior's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. Turn around. Right away. Do not come back. 6 months earlier, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison had believed her biggest worry was whether her husband would remember to write from his business trip to San Francisco. She'd been wrong about so many things. Now, as she watched these 2 men face each other like wolves circling prey, she pressed both hands against her swollen belly and wondered how a Boston schoolteacher had ended up at the center of a standoff that could ignite the entire Apache territory. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing the tension crackling through the desert air like lightning before a storm. The captain's eyes flicked to her face, then back to the warrior. Ma'am, I'm here to take you home. Home, the word felt foreign on her tongue now. Home was where someone cared whether you lived or died. Home was where you weren't left alone in the desert to feed the buzzards because you carried an inconvenient truth in your belly. I am home, she heard herself say, her voice stronger than she felt. The warrior's shoulders relaxed just a fraction, but his hand never moved from the knife at his belt. He'd saved her when her own people had abandoned her. He'd given her water when she was dying of thirst, shelter when she had nowhere to turn, and something she'd never expected to find again. Hope. But now the outside world had found them, and Sarah knew this moment had been inevitable from the day she'd first looked into those dark, honest eyes and seen her future reflected there. The captain spat tobacco juice into the red dirt. This ain't over. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Sarah felt the baby turn restlessly in her womb, and she wondered if their fragile peace was about to shatter like glass against stone. The memory of that confrontation still burned in Sarah's mind as she remembered how this impossible love story had begun. But first, you need to understand just how far a woman can fall when the men she trusts decide her life is worth less than their reputations. 3 days of walking through hell had taught Sarah Morrison that the human body could endure far more than any Boston finishing school had prepared her for. The Arizona territory stretched endlessly in every direction, a landscape so hostile it seemed designed to strip hope from the strongest soul. Her once elegant traveling dress hung in tatters, the deep blue fabric now stained with dust, sweat, and the copper taste of desperation. She'd stopped counting her steps somewhere after the first 1,000. Water had run out yesterday, or was it the day before? Time moved differently when every breath felt like swallowing broken glass and every step might be your last. The baby in her womb had been restless at first, turning and kicking as if protesting this harsh journey, but now lay ominously still. Just a little further, she whispered to the child she might never hold. Mama's going to find help. But help seemed as distant as the purple mountains shimmering in the heat haze. She'd been walking toward them for what felt like days, yet they appeared no closer than when she'd started. The desert played tricks on your mind, she'd learned, made you see things that weren't there, believe in miracles that would never come. Her husband's business partner had been very clear about the terms when he'd abandoned her at that trading post in Tucson. Jonathan died of fever 2 months ago, William Hartwell had announced with all the emotion of discussing cattle prices. Any claims you might have made on his estate died with him, especially considering your condition. The way he'd looked at her belly had made Sarah's skin crawl. 7 months along, there was no hiding her pregnancy anymore, no pretending the child belonged to her dead husband when everyone knew Jonathan had been away on business for nearly a year before his death. The baby isn't Jonathan's, she'd admitted, lifting her chin with what dignity she could muster. But I am still his widow, and I have rights. You have nothing. Hartwell's words had cut like a blade. Your lover's bastard gives you no claim to Morrison property. Consider yourself lucky I'm not pressing charges for adultery. Lucky, Sarah almost laughed at the memory as she stumbled over a rock and nearly fell. Lucky would have been Jonathan coming home when he'd promised instead of dying alone in some San Francisco hotel room. Lucky would have been never meeting Thomas Whitfield, the handsome young doctor who'd made her feel alive again after 2 years of marriage to a man who treated her like expensive furniture. Lucky would have been Thomas not disappearing the moment she'd told him about the baby. The sun hammered down mercilessly, and Sarah's vision began to blur at the edges. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her throat so dry she could no longer swallow. Each breath felt like inhaling fire. She'd read about people dying of thirst in the desert, but she'd never imagined it would be this slow, this aware. A shadow passed overhead, buzzards circling with patient hunger. They knew what she was just beginning to accept. She was going to die out here and her unborn child with her. The men who'd brought her to this wasteland had probably planned it that way. Easier to let the desert solve their problem than dirty their hands directly. Sarah sank to her knees, the rocky ground biting through her torn skirt. Maybe it was better this way. At least her child would never know the shame of being born bastard to a woman society had already condemned. Never know the pain of being unwanted, unwelcome in a world that judged harshly and forgave little. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. God seemed as distant as those purple mountains, if he existed at all in this godless place. A sound made her look up, the soft whisper of moccasins on stone. What Sarah saw next would change everything she thought she knew about survival, mercy, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. The Apache warrior materialized from the desert like a mirage becoming flesh. Sarah blinked hard, certain her dying mind was playing its final cruel trick. But he remained solid and real against the burning landscape. Tall and lean, with long black hair bound by a strip of leather, he moved with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to this harsh land in ways she never could. She should have been terrified. Every story she'd heard about Apache raids and captive white women should have sent her scrambling backward, but her body had no strength left for fear. Instead, she found herself studying his face, strong-boned and weathered, with eyes so dark they seemed to hold all the mysteries of the desert night. He approached slowly like a hunter careful not to spook wounded prey. When he knelt beside her, she caught the scent of sage and wood smoke clinging to his buckskin shirt. His eyes moved from her face to her swollen belly, and something shifted in his expression. A recognition, perhaps, of the life struggling to survive within her. Water, she croaked, the word barely a whisper. Without hesitation, he lifted a water gourd from his side and held it to her cracked lips. The liquid was warm and tasted of leather, but it might as well have been the finest wine. Sarah drank greedily, desperately, until he gently pulled the gourd away. Slow, he said in accented English. Too much, sick. His voice was deep and quiet, carrying none of the harsh authority she'd grown accustomed to from white men. There was something almost gentle in the way he spoke, as if words were precious things not to be wasted. She nodded, understanding. Her body was already cramping from the water she'd gulped down. He offered the gourd again, and this time she sipped carefully, letting each precious drop ease the fire in her throat. My baby, she whispered, pressing a hand to her belly. Is my baby? He placed his own hand beside hers, fingers spread wide across the buckskin that covered her dress. They waited in silence, and after what felt like eternity, Sarah felt a flutter of movement beneath their joined hands. The warrior's eyes met hers, and she saw something unexpected there. Relief. Strong, he said simply. Tears she'd thought she had no moisture left to shed spilled down Sarah's cheeks. Thank you, she breathed. Thank you. He studied her face for a long moment, taking in her torn dress, her sunburned skin, the desperation that clung to her like dust. When he spoke again, His voice carried a weight that suggested he understood more than just her immediate need for rescue. You are alone. It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded anyway. They left me to die. Something flickered in his dark eyes, anger perhaps, or recognition of a cruelty he'd seen before. Your man? Dead. The word came out flat and bitter. The baby. The baby isn't his. She expected judgment, disgust, the same condemnation she'd faced from everyone who'd learned her secret. Instead, the warrior's expression remained unchanged, as if the circumstances of her child's conception meant nothing to him, compared to the simple fact that both mother and baby needed help. He stood and extended his hand. Come. Sarah stared at that offered hand, brown and scarred from countless battles with the desert, yet steady and sure. Taking it would mean trusting her life to a man whose people were considered enemies by everyone she'd ever known. But what choice did she have? The alternative was death for both her and her child. She placed her pale hand in his dark one and let him help her to her feet. Her legs shook with weakness, and she would have fallen if not for his steady grip on her arm. He guided her steps toward a cluster of rocks where she could see the glint of water seeping from a hidden spring. Rest here, he said, helping her settle into the shade. I bring horse. Wait, Sarah caught his sleeve as he turned to go. Why are you helping me? He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were so quiet she had to strain to hear them. All life is sacred, mother and child most sacred of all. Then he was gone, moving away across the desert with the same silent grace that had brought him to her. Sarah leaned back against the cool rock and closed her eyes, one hand still resting on her belly. She didn't know this man's name, didn't know what would happen when he returned. But for the first time in days, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope was a dangerous thing to carry in a world that had already broken her heart twice. But as she felt her baby stir beneath her hand, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this story wouldn't end with death in the desert after all. When the Apache warrior returned with his horse, Sarah realized she was about to cross a line that would change her forever, if she had the courage to step over it. The paint horse was a beautiful creature, its coat marked with patches of white and brown, like scattered clouds against an autumn sky. The warrior moved with easy confidence as he approached, leading the animal by a simple rope halter, rather than the elaborate bridle and saddle Sarah was accustomed to seeing on white men's horses. Can you ride? He asked, studying her swollen form with practical concern. Sarah almost laughed at the question. 6 months ago, she'd been a proper Boston lady who rode side saddle in the park on Sunday afternoons, wearing a fashionable habit and followed by a protective groom. Now she was a pregnant woman abandoned in the desert, and proper riding techniques seemed like memories from someone else's life. I'll manage, she said, accepting his help to stand. He cupped his hands to give her a boost up, and Sarah found herself seated astride the horse's back, her torn skirt hiked up in a way that would have scandalized her mother's memory. The warrior swung up behind her with fluid grace, his arms encircling her as he took the rope reins. The intimacy of their position should have shocked her, but Sarah was beyond caring about propriety. His body was warm and solid against her back, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time in days, she felt truly safe. What's your name? She asked as they began to move across the desert, the horse picking its way carefully over the rocky ground. Naalnish, he replied. In your tongue, he who works. I'm Sarah Morrison. He was quiet for so long that she wondered if he would respond at all. Finally, he said, Sarah is good name, means princess in the old language. The irony wasn't lost on her. Princess, she felt more like a beggar, dependent on the kindness of a stranger for her very survival. Where are we going? My people have winter camp in the mountains. Safe place. Good water, shelter from wind. Sarah's heart clenched with sudden fear. Apache camp. She'd heard the stories, white women taken captive, forced into lives of slavery, or worse. But as they rode, she found herself studying the man behind her, trying to reconcile the gentle way he'd given her water with the savage reputation of his people. Will your people accept me? She felt rather than saw his shrug. You carry life. Apache honor the woman who brings new life into world. Your skin color. Another pause. Less important than baby's life. They rode in companionable silence after that, Sarah's body gradually relaxing against his as the horse carried them toward the distant mountains. The desert began to change subtly, more vegetation, the occasional twisted tree providing blessed shade. They were climbing now, following what seemed to be a well-known trail, though Sarah could see no obvious path. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself fighting exhaustion. The heat, the stress, and the sheer relief of being rescued had drained what little strength she'd had left. Her head began to numb, and more than once she felt herself starting to slide sideways before Naalnish's steady arm pulled her back against his chest. "Sleep," he said quietly. "Long ride ahead." "I'm fine," she protested, but even as she spoke, her eyelids were growing heavy. "Sleep," he repeated, and this time his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I will not let you fall." Something in his tone convinced her to trust him completely. Sarah let her eyes close and her body relax, feeling safer than she had in months. She dozed fitfully, waking occasionally to find they were still climbing, still following the invisible trail toward the purple mountains that had seemed so unreachable when she'd been on foot. It was during one of these half-waking moments that she became aware of voices ahead. Apache voices, speaking in rapid, musical tones she couldn't understand. Sarah's eyes flew open, and she felt Naalnish's arm tighten protectively around her waist. "Easy," he murmured in her ear. "They are my brothers. They will not harm you." Three warriors materialized from behind a stand of juniper trees, their horses as sure-footed on the rocky trail as mountain goats. They wore simple clothing like Naalnish, buckskin leggings and shirts, their long hair bound with strips of leather. But their eyes were hard as they studied Sarah, and she heard the sharp edge in their voices as they spoke to Naalnish in their own language. Sarah understood none of the words, but the tone was clear enough. They were questioning his decision to bring her here. One of them gestured angrily at her belly, his voice rising with what could only be objection. Naalnish's response was calm but firm, his voice carrying the same quiet authority she'd heard before. The argument went on for several minutes, with Sarah feeling more uncomfortable with each passing second. She was the subject of this heated discussion, and the outcome would determine whether she lived or died. Finally, the eldest of the three warriors, a man with graying hair and a face like weathered stone, spoke a few sharp words that seemed to settle the matter. The others fell silent, though their expressions remained skeptical. "What did he say?" Sarah whispered. Naalnish urged their horse forward, following the others as they resumed their journey up the mountain trail. When he answered, his voice carried something that might have been amusement. "He said the spirits have strange ways of testing us, and perhaps you are a test we are meant to pass." Sarah wasn't sure if that was reassuring or terrifying, but as they climbed higher into the mountains and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, she realized she was about to discover just how far from her old life this journey would take her. What Sarah discovered at the Apache winter camp would shatter every assumption she'd ever held about civilization, savagery, and what it truly meant to belong somewhere. The camp nestled in a natural amphitheater of red stone, sheltered from the worst winds by towering canyon walls that glowed like fire in the last light of sunset. Wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings made of bent saplings and covered with hides and brush, dotted the protected space like sleeping animals. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the sound of children's laughter echoed off the stone walls. It was nothing like the savage encampment Sarah had imagined. As they rode into the camp, people emerged from their dwellings to stare at the strange sight of Naalnish, returning with a pregnant white woman. Sarah felt their eyes on her like a physical weight, studying her torn dress, her sunburned face, her obvious condition. But there was more curiosity than hostility in their gazes, and several of the women stepped forward with what looked like genuine concern. An elderly woman approached their horse, her face deeply lined, but her eyes bright with intelligence. She spoke rapidly to Naalnish in Apache, gesturing at Sarah's belly, and Sarah caught the unmistakable tone of maternal worry in her voice. Naalnish dismounted first, then helped Sarah down with careful hands. Her legs nearly buckled after hours of riding, and she swayed on her feet until the old woman stepped forward to steady her. "This is my grandmother," Naalnish explained. "Her name is Changing Woman. She is medicine woman for women's troubles. The grandmother's hands moved expertly over Sarah's belly, pressing gently here and there while maintaining a stream of Apache words that Sarah somehow understood were reassuring despite the language barrier. When the old woman smiled and nodded, Sarah felt tears of relief spring into her eyes. Baby is strong, Naalnish translated. Grandmother says you are strong too, to have walked so far in the desert heat. Other women gathered around them now, their initial wariness giving way to the universal feminine instinct to care for a woman in need. They clucked disapprovingly over Sarah's condition, bringing water in gourd cups and what looked like dried meat mixed with berries. One young woman, barely more than a girl, offered Sarah a soft hide to sit on. They want to help, Naalnish said, and Sarah heard something like surprise in his voice, as if he hadn't expected his people to accept her so readily. Thank you, Sarah said to the women surrounding her, knowing they wouldn't understand her words, but hoping her tone would convey her gratitude. Several of them smiled and nodded, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the food they were pressing on her. As darkness fell and the camp settled into its evening rhythms, Sarah found herself seated beside one of the cooking fires, watching Apache women go about their daily tasks. She'd expected to feel like an outsider, a captive, but instead she felt oddly at home. These women laughed and gossiped and tended their children with the same easy familiarity she'd known in Boston, and their kindness to a stranger spoke to something universal about motherhood that transcended culture and color. Naalnish sat nearby, speaking quietly with several of the men. Sarah caught him glancing in her direction frequently, and each time their eyes met, she felt that same flutter of awareness that had surprised her during their long ride. You are safe here, said a voice beside her in careful English. Sarah turned to see a young Apache woman, perhaps her own age, settling onto the hide beside her. I am Diji. I speak your tongue some. Learned from trader. I'm Sarah, she replied gratefully. Thank you for all of this. I don't know how to repay such kindness. Diji smiled, her teeth white in the firelight. You carry life. That is gift enough. But, she glanced toward Naalnish, then back to Sarah with obvious curiosity. Why does he bring you here? Naalnish is, how you say, careful man. He does not act without reason. Sarah followed her gaze to where Naalnish sat listening to the older men talk. In the firelight, his face looked carved from bronze, all strong lines and shadows. He saved my life, she said simply. I was dying in the desert. Many die in desert, Diji pointed out. Naalnish does not save them all. The implication in her words made Sarah's cheeks warm. I don't understand. But Diji just smiled and said nothing more, turning her attention back to the strip of hide she was softening with the practiced hands. Sarah watched her work, mesmerized by the rhythmic scraping motion, until a commotion near the edge of camp drew everyone's attention. A rider was approaching at speed, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. He called out in Apache as he dismounted, his words urgent and sharp with warning. The relaxed atmosphere of the camp changed instantly, conversation stopping as people gathered to hear what he had to say. Sarah saw Naalnish rise to his feet, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. His face had gone hard, all traces of the gentle man who had given her water in the desert replaced by something fierce and dangerous. What is it? Sarah asked Diji, fear climbing her throat like a living thing. The young woman's face had gone pale beneath her bronze skin. Soldiers, she whispered. Blue coats, many of them. They ask questions in the towns about pregnant white women. Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins. They were looking for her. The people who had abandoned her to die in the desert hadn't been content to let the heat and thirst finish their work. They wanted to be sure, and now her presence had brought danger to the very people who had shown her nothing but kindness. The next few hours would test everything Sarah thought she knew about courage, loyalty, and how far someone would go to protect the helpless, even when that someone was supposed to be her enemy. The council fire burned long into the night as the Apache leaders debated in urgent, hushed tones. Sarah sat wrapped in a borrowed blanket, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched their faces in the flickering light. She couldn't understand their words, but their expressions told her everything she needed to know. They were arguing about her, whether to keep her or send her away, whether the risk of harboring a white woman was worth the inevitable confrontation with the soldiers. Naalnish spoke several times during the discussion, his voice calm but insistent. Each time he gestured towards Sarah, she saw some of the older men shake their heads, their faces grim with the weight of leadership. These weren't savage raiders, she realized. They were fathers and grandfathers trying to keep their people safe in an increasingly dangerous world. "What will happen to me?" she asked DG in a whisper. The young woman's face was troubled. "Some say you should go. Too dangerous to keep you here, but Naalnish—" She glanced toward the fire where he stood speaking passionately to the council. "He says you are under his protection now. Says he will take you far away rather than let you fall into soldier hands again." Sarah's throat tightened. He barely knew her, yet he was willing to risk his standing with his own people to keep her safe. Why would he do that? DG studied her face in the dim light. "You really do not know?" Before Sarah could ask what she meant, the council broke up with sharp words and hard looks. Some of the men walked away, shaking their heads, while others lingered to speak quietly with the elderly chief. Naalnish approached Sarah with long strides, his face unreadable in the darkness. "We must go," he said simply. "Before dawn." "Where?" Sarah struggled to her feet, the baby heavy in her belly making her movements clumsy. "North, into the high mountains where soldiers cannot follow easily." "There is a place, Mupin." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "A sacred place where my people have hidden in bad times before. You will be safe there until baby comes." Sarah felt tears threaten. "I can't ask you to do this. Your people need you here." "My people need peace more than they need me," Naalnish replied, but she heard the pain beneath his practical words. "And you need protection." The choice is made. Within an hour, they were ready to leave. Changing Woman pressed dried food and medicine bundles into Sarah's hands, speaking rapidly in Apache while tears tracked down her weathered cheeks. The old woman's meaning was clear even without translation. Be safe, be strong, take care of the baby. Other women of the camp gathered to say goodbye, touching Sarah's hands and offering what comfort they could in their own language. She was amazed by their kindness to a stranger who had brought nothing but trouble to their doorstep. As they prepared to mount Naalnish's horse, a young warrior jogged up to them, leading a second animal, a gentle-looking mare with kind eyes and a patient disposition. "From my cousin," Naalnish explained. "He says a woman carrying life should not have to ride behind a man like baggage." Sarah's eyes filled with grateful tears as she stroked the mare's soft nose. In her own world, she'd been abandoned and cast aside like something broken and worthless. Here, among people she'd been taught to fear, she'd found more genuine care and consideration than she'd received from anyone who shared her skin color. They rode out of camp in the pre-dawn darkness, following a trail that seemed to exist only in Naalnish's memory. The path led ever upward, winding through stands of pine and aspen that whispered in the cool mountain air. Behind them, the desert spread out like a sea of shadows, hiding the camp where Sarah had briefly tasted what it might feel like to belong somewhere. As the sun rose, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Sarah found herself riding beside a man who had given up everything to keep her safe. She studied his profile as he scanned the trail ahead, noting the strong line of his arm, the way his dark eyes missed nothing, the quiet competence in every movement. "Why, she asked finally, the question that had been burning in her chest since the council meeting. He was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were barely audible over the sound of their horses' hooves on stone. "My wife died carrying our child 3 summers ago. I held them both as they died, and I could do nothing." His voice carried old grief, pain that had been worn smooth by time but never truly healed. "I swore then that I would never again watch a woman and child suffer when I had the power to help." Sarah's heart clenched with understanding. He wasn't saving her out of love or even attraction. He was trying to balance some cosmic scale to make amends for a loss he couldn't prevent. It should have hurt to realize she was more symbol than person to him, but instead she felt a deep well of empathy for the pain he carried. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He glanced at her, and for just a moment his careful mask slipped. She saw raw grief there, and loneliness, and something else that made her pulse quicken. "So am I," he replied. And she wasn't sure if he was talking about his wife or something else entirely. They rode on in silence, climbing toward a future neither of them could predict, while behind them in the distance, dust clouds rose against the desert sky, the unmistakable sign of riders following their trail. The next few days of running and hiding would forge a bond between Sarah and Naalnish that went deeper than gratitude or even survival, though neither was ready to admit what was growing between them. The sacred place the Naalnish had spoken of turned out to be a hidden canyon high in the mountains, accessible only through a narrow cleft in the rock that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. A small stream ran through the canyon floor, and natural caves in the cliff face provided shelter from wind and weather. "My grandmother's grandmother hid here during the wars with the Mexicans," Naalnish explained as he helped Sarah down from her horse. "The spirits protect this place." Sarah could feel why the Apache considered it sacred. The canyon walls rose like cathedral spires toward a narrow strip of sky, and the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. Ancient pictographs covered sections of the rock face, human figures and animals painted in red ochre by hands that had been dust for generations. "It's beautiful," she breathed, turning slowly to take in the otherworldly landscape. Naalnish watched her face as she explored their refuge, something shifting in his expression as he saw her wonder and appreciation. "You are not afraid of being alone here? Away from your people?" Sarah almost laughed at the irony. "My people abandoned me to die, remember? I feel safer here than I have anywhere else in months." That evening, as they sat beside a small fire near the mouth of one of the caves, Sarah found herself studying the man who had become her unlikely protector. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the strong bones of his face and the way his long hair caught the golden glow. He was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with civilized polish and everything to do with strength, competence, and an innate dignity that needed no adornment. "Tell me about your wife," she said gently, surprised by her own boldness. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "Ayana." Her name meant eternal blossom. She was light, laughter. She could find joy in the smallest things, a bird's song, the pattern of frost on winter grass. His hands clenched slightly around the stick he'd been using to tend the fire. The baby was her dream. She wanted it so much when the birth went wrong. "You don't have to tell me," Sarah said, seeing the pain in his face. "She bled," he continued as if he hadn't heard her. "For 3 days she fought, but the bleeding would not stop. The baby, our son, he was too small, born too early. He never drew breath." Naalnish's voice cracked slightly. "I buried them together beneath the cottonwood where we were married, and I swore I would never love again because the pain of losing them nearly killed me." Sarah felt tears slide down her cheeks for this man's grief, for the wife and child he'd lost, for the way sorrow had carved itself into his soul. Without thinking, she reached across the space between them and laid her hand over his. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." He looked down at their joined hands, and Sarah saw something flicker in his dark eyes, surprise, perhaps, at his own willingness to accept comfort from another person. He didn't pull away. "What of you?" he asked finally. "The father of your child, did you love him?" Sarah's throat tightened with old shame and hurt. "I thought I did. Thomas was charming, handsome. He made me feel alive in a way I'd never experienced with my husband. Jonathan was a good man, but our marriage was arranged by our families. There was respect between us, but not passion. When Thomas came along," she shrugged, feeling foolish. "I was lonely and flattered by his attention. I thought what we had was real, but it was not. The moment I told him about the baby, he disappeared. Just gone. I found out later he'd been courting another woman at the same time, a banker's daughter with a substantial dowry. I was just entertainment, I suppose. A diversion from his real plans." Naalnish's hand tightened beneath hers. "He is a fool." The simple statement, spoken with such quiet conviction, did more to heal Sarah's wounded heart than months of self-recrimination had achieved. She looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You are not entertainment, he said, his voice rough with some emotion she couldn't name. You are, he paused, seeming to struggle for the right words in English. Worthy, deserving of respect, of protection, of love. Something electric passed between them in that moment, a recognition that went beyond words. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized what was happening. This proud, wounded Apache warrior was falling in love with her, just as she was falling in love with him. The thought should have terrified her. She was a white woman carrying another man's child, a refugee dependent on his protection in a world that would condemn them both for even speaking to each other. But sitting beside the fire in their hidden canyon, watching the stars appear one by one in the narrow strip of sky above them, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. She felt hope. A sound from outside the canyon, the distant whinny of a horse, shattered the moment like glass. Both of them froze, listening, and then Naalnish was on his feet with fluid grace, his hand moving to his rifle. Stay here, he commanded, melting into the shadows at the canyon mouth. Sarah pressed both hands to her belly, feeling the baby stir restlessly, as if sensing her fear. Someone had found them. Their brief respite in paradise was over, and the outside world was closing in once again. What happened next would test every ounce of courage Sarah thought she possessed and prove that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one pointing a gun at you. It's the one who claims to be your salvation. The rider who emerged from the darkness wasn't wearing the blue uniform Sarah had expected. Instead, a tall man in a dusty black coat led his lathered horse toward the canyon entrance, calling out in a voice that made Sarah's blood run cold. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, I know you're in there. Thomas Whitfield, the father of her unborn child, had somehow tracked her to this impossible place, though how he'd managed it seemed beyond belief. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the cave, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it would give her away. I've come to take you home, Sarah, Thomas called out, his voice carrying the same smooth charm that had once made her heart flutter. Now it sounded like poison honey. I know you've been through an ordeal, but I'm here now. Everything can be made right. Naalnish materialized beside her like a ghost, his rifle ready and his face grim. Who is this man? He whispered. The baby's father, Sarah breathed, barely able to get the words out. Something dangerous flickered in Naalnish's eyes. The one who abandoned you. Sarah nodded, unable to speak, past the fear clawing at her throat. Thomas was here, which meant others might be close behind. It meant the fragile safety of their hidden canyon had been compromised. It meant everything they'd built together was about to be destroyed. Sarah, please. Thomas's voice took on a pleading tone. I know I made mistakes, but I'm here to make amends. I've been searching for you for weeks. When I heard what happened in Tucson, how that bastard Hartwell abandoned you, his voice hardened with what sounded like righteous anger. I've come to marry you, darling, to give our child a name. Lies, Naalnish said quietly, but with absolute certainty. A man who abandons a woman does not suddenly grow honor. Sarah knew he was right, but part of her, the part that had been raised to believe a woman needed a man's protection, that a child needed a father's name, wavered. What if Thomas truly had changed? What if he was offering her a chance to return to civilization, to give her baby a legitimate future? I have money now, Sarah, Thomas continued, his voice growing more confident as her silence stretched on. Enough to set us up anywhere you'd like. San Francisco, maybe, or even back east. We could start fresh, leave all this unpleasantness behind. How did you find me? Sarah called out finally, needing answers before she could even consider his offer. I hired the best tracker in the territory. Cost me a fortune, but you're worth it, darling. You and our child both. His voice turned cajoling, the tone she remembered from their secret meetings. Come out, Sarah. Let's talk face to face. Surely you don't want to spend the rest of your life hiding in caves with savages? The casual slur against Naalnish's people made Sarah's temper flare. These people saved my life when your business partner left me to die. Hartwell exceeded his authority, Thomas replied smoothly. I never told him to do that. If I'd been there, none of this would have happened. But something in his tone rang false, and Sarah felt the first cold touch of real understanding. You weren't there because you were already gone, she said slowly. You disappeared the moment I told you about the baby. I needed time to arrange things. You needed time to decide whether I was worth the trouble. Sarah's voice grew stronger as anger replaced fear. And you decided I wasn't, until something changed. What changed, Thomas? What made me valuable enough to hunt down in Apache territory? The silence that followed was answer enough. Sarah felt Naalnish tense beside her, reading the same threat she was beginning to understand. The will, Thomas said finally, his smooth facade cracking slightly. Jonathan's will was found in his effects in San Francisco. Apparently, he'd changed it shortly before his death, left everything to you, with a provision that if anything happened to you, everything would go to your children. All of it, Sarah, the shipping company, the warehouses, the house in Boston. You're worth a fortune. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Thomas hadn't come to save her out of love or guilt. He'd come because she was suddenly valuable. With her dead, the baby would inherit everything away, and as the child's father, he would control that inheritance. And if I die in childbirth? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Well, that would be tragic, of course, but at least our child would want for nothing. Naalnish's rifle barrel caught the starlight as he shifted position. He speaks of your death too easily, he murmured in her ear. Sarah nodded, fear and fury warring in her chest. Thomas had never intended to marry her or give their child legitimacy. He'd tracked her down to claim his inheritance, and if she conveniently died in the process, so much the better for him. I'm not coming with you, Thomas, she called out, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Don't be foolish, Sarah. You can't possibly mean to stay out here living like an animal with these people. Think of the child. I am thinking of the child, Sarah interrupted. That's why I'm staying with someone who actually cares whether we live or die. The mask dropped from Thomas's voice entirely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. You're making a mistake, Sarah. A very serious mistake. I'm offering you a chance to return to civilization, to respectability. If you refuse, you'll what? Sarah stepped to the edge of the cave where Thomas could see her silhouette against the firelight. Murder me yourself instead of letting the desert do it? Thomas's laugh was ugly in the darkness. Murder? My dear Sarah, you're living with Apache raiders. Everyone knows how dangerous that is. If something were to happen to you out here, well, who would question it? The threat was unmistakable, and Sarah felt ice forming in her veins. But beside her, Naalnish moved with deadly purpose, his rifle trained on the man who had just threatened the woman under his protection. The confrontation that followed would prove once and for all that true strength has nothing to do with the color of your skin or the culture that raised you, and everything to do with what you're willing to sacrifice for the people you love. You are not welcome here, Naalnish called out in English, his voice carrying the quiet authority Sarah had come to recognize as far more dangerous than any shout. Leave now while you still can. Thomas's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. And what are you going to do, savage? Shoot an unarmed white man? They'll hunt your people to extinction for that. You came armed, Naalnish replied calmly. I can see the gun at your hip from here. Sarah squinted into the darkness and realized he was right. Thomas's coat had fallen open, revealing the gleam of a pistol butt. He hadn't come as a suitor seeking reconciliation. He'd come as a hunter tracking valuable prey. That's for protection against wild animals, Thomas said smoothly. A man has to be careful in Apache country. You never know when you might encounter something dangerous. The threat was clear, but Naalnish remained unmoved. Yes, he agreed quietly. Dangerous things are everywhere. Sometimes they wear suits and speak with soft voices. Thomas's facade began to crack in earnest. I don't have time for this primitive nonsense. Sarah, you have 1 minute to come out of there, or I start making noise. Lots of noise, the kind that draws attention from miles around. Sarah felt cold fear wash through her. If Thomas brought soldiers to the sacred canyon, it wouldn't just endanger her and Naalnish. It would desecrate a place the Apache held holy. She couldn't be responsible for that. Don't, she said, stepping forward again. Please, Thomas, just leave. Forget you found me. Tell everyone I died in the desert and take what comfort you can from that lie. Can't do that, darling. Too much money at stake. Thomas's smile was visible even in the dim light, and it was nothing like the charming expression Sarah remembered. This was the smile of a predator closing in on wounded prey. Besides, even if I wanted to walk away, I'm not alone. As if summoned by his words, more riders appeared at the canyon mouth. 4 men, all armed, all wearing the hard expressions of men who were paid to do violence. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the scope of Thomas's planning. He hadn't come to rescue her. He'd come to collect his investment. Now then, Thomas continued, his voice taking on the satisfied tone of a man holding all the cards. I think we can discuss this like civilized people. Come out, Sarah. Bring your companion. Let's settle this properly. Sarah felt Naalnish tense beside her, calculating odds and angles. 5 armed men against 1 Apache warrior and a pregnant woman. The mathematics of survival weren't promising. There is another way, Naalnish murmured in her ear. A path through the caves that leads to the far side of the canyon. You could be gone before they realize. No, Sarah's voice was firm despite the fear clawing at her throat. I won't run anymore. I won't let you sacrifice yourself to save me. Sarah, I said no. She turned to face him fully, seeing the frustration and something deeper in his dark eyes. These men aren't just going to disappear if I escape. They'll hurt you, probably kill you, and then they'll keep hunting me. It has to end here. Naalnish studied her face in the firelight, and she saw the moment he recognized the same stubborn determination that had carried her across miles of desert. What do you want to do? Sarah looked toward the canyon mouth where Thomas waited with his hired guns, then back at the man who had given up everything to protect her. An idea was forming in her mind. Desperate and dangerous, but possibly their only chance. How well do you trust me, she asked. With my life. The simple certainty in his voice gave her the courage she needed. Then let me handle this my way, but be ready to shoot if things go wrong. Before Naalnish could protest, Sarah walked toward the canyon entrance with her hands visible and empty. Thomas straightened as she approached, his smile returning. There's my sensible girl, he said, dismounting and taking a step toward her. I knew you'd see reason. Oh, I see everything very clearly now, Sarah replied, stopping just outside easy reaching distance. I see exactly what kind of man you are, Thomas. What I don't understand is why you think I'd trust you with my life after you've already tried to have me killed once. Thomas's eyes narrowed. I never... Hartwell didn't act alone, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Men like him don't make decisions that big without orders from someone higher up the ladder. You told him to get rid of me, didn't you, before you knew about the inheritance? You're being ridiculous. Am I? Then explain how you found me. Explain how you knew exactly where to look in thousands of square miles of desert. Explain how you hired the best tracker in the territory when 6 months ago you couldn't afford to marry me because you were courting that banker's daughter for her dowry. Thomas's mask slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Very clever, Sarah. I always said you were too smart for your own good. Not smart enough, apparently. I believed you when you said you loved me. I believed your promises about the future we'd build together. Sarah's voice carried all the pain and betrayal of the past months, but underneath it was something new, strength forged in desert fire and tempered by the kindness of people she'd been taught to fear. I needed the banker's money to fund this expedition, Thomas admitted, apparently deciding honesty was his best strategy now. Finding you wasn't cheap, but Jonathan's inheritance changes everything. We can be together now, Sarah, rich and respected, with our child's future secured. Our child, Sarah shook her head sadly. You still don't understand, do you? This baby isn't yours anymore. Not in any way that matters. She placed both hands over her belly, feeling the life stirring within, and looked directly into Thomas's eyes. I choose Naalnish. I choose the man who saved my life over the one who tried to end it. I choose honor over wealth, love over convenience. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. Then Thomas's face twisted with rage, and his hand moved toward his gun. That's when Sarah discovered she'd made the right choice because the man behind her was already moving to protect her, and his love was faster than Thomas's greed. The gunfight that erupted in the sacred canyon would become the stuff of legend among the Apache, but for Sarah, it was simply the moment she learned what it meant to fight for the life you've chosen instead of the one you've been given. Naalnish's rifle cracked like thunder between the stone walls, and one of Thomas's hired guns toppled from his saddle before the man's own weapon had cleared leather. The others scattered, seeking cover behind rocks and horses while their employer dove for shelter behind a boulder, cursing viciously. "Get down!" Naalnish shouted, and Sarah dropped to her belly just as bullets began whining off the canyon walls where she'd been standing. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing and re-echoing until it seemed like a small war had erupted. Sarah crawled toward the cave mouth where Naalnish had taken position, her swollen belly making the movement awkward and painful. She could see him working the lever of his rifle with practiced efficiency, each shot carefully aimed and deadly accurate. Another of Thomas's men cried out and fell, clutching his shoulder. "Can't hit what you can't see, you red devil!" one of the gunmen shouted, spraying bullets wildly toward their position. Most went high, chipping stone from the canyon walls and sending red dust showering down like bloody rain. But Naalnish seemed to know exactly where each man was hiding, even in the darkness. He'd grown up in this country, had learned to read the land like other men read books. Every shadow, every sound told him something about his enemy's positions. Sarah pressed herself against the cave wall and tried to think. 3 men were left besides Thomas, all of them desperate now, and probably realizing they'd badly underestimated their opposition. Desperate men did stupid things, and she was terrified one of them would rush their position or try to flank around through the caves. "Sarah!" Thomas's voice echoed off the rocks, shrill with panic. "Call off your savage! This doesn't have to end in bloodshed." "You brought the bloodshed with you," she shouted back. "I didn't ask you to come here." "I'm trying to save you, damn it! You and our child both." Another rifle shot answered him, and Thomas yelped as stone fragments exploded near his head. Naalnish's message was clear. He didn't believe Thomas's claims about salvation any more than Sarah did. A new sound reached Sarah's ears then, the distant rumble of approaching horses, many horses, moving fast across the desert floor below. Her heart sank as she realized Thomas might have been telling the truth about not being alone. If he'd brought an entire troop of cavalry. But when the riders appeared at the canyon mouth, they weren't wearing blue uniforms. They were Apache warriors, armed and painted for war, led by the same gray-haired chief who had spoken at the council fire. Sarah recognized several faces from the camp they'd left behind. Thomas's remaining men took one look at the new arrivals and threw down their weapons, hands raised high in surrender. Even hired guns had enough sense to know when they were outnumbered and outmatched. "No!" Thomas screamed, rising from behind his boulder with his pistol in his hand. "She's mine! The baby is mine! I won't let you take what belongs to me!" He swung the gun towards Sarah, his face twisted with rage and desperation. But before he could pull the trigger, 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Naalnish's rifle and the war chief's revolver, both aimed with deadly precision. Thomas Whitfield crumpled to the ground like a marionette with cut strings, his unfired pistol clattering on the stone beside him. The sudden silence that followed felt almost supernatural after the chaos of gunfire. Sarah's ears were ringing, and the smell of burned powder hung in the air like incense. She looked from Thomas's still form to the Apache warriors surrounding his defeated men, then finally to Naalnish, who was already moving toward her with concern etched on his face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands gentle as they checked her over for wounds. "No, we're both fine," Sarah managed, still struggling to believe it was over. "But why did your people come? How did they know?" The war chief approached them, his weathered face grave but not unkind. When he spoke, it was in careful English, clearly meant for Sarah's benefit. "Young warriors were restless after you left. They followed at distance to be sure you were safe. When they saw the white men tracking you," he shrugged. "Apache protect Apache, and you are Apache now, whether you know it or not." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes at his words. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, Men who had risked their lives to save a white woman and her unborn child, who had declared her one of their own, despite every difference between them. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for what she felt. The chief nodded, then turned his attention to the surviving gunmen. "These men will be taken back to the white settlements and told to spread word. Apache territory is not safe for those who hunt innocent women." The dead one. He glanced at Thomas's body with distaste. "Buzzards must eat too." As the warriors began securing their prisoners, Naalnish took Sarah's hand and led her back toward the fire they'd built. She was shaking now that the danger had passed, reactions setting in as her body realized how close they'd all come to disaster. "Is it really over?" she asked, settling carefully onto the hide blanket they'd spread beside the flames. Naalnish knelt beside her, his dark eyes serious. "The immediate danger, yes, but there will be other challenges. Your people will not easily accept what you have chosen." Sarah thought about that, about the life she was turning her back on, and the uncertain future she was embracing. Then she looked at this man who had risked everything for her, who had shown her what real love looked like. "Then we'll face those challenges together," she said simply. The baby chose that moment to kick vigorously, as if adding its own voice to the conversation. Naalnish's hand joined hers on her belly, and his rare smile transformed his face. "Together," he agreed, and in that word Sarah heard the promise of a love that would last beyond the dangers of tonight, beyond the prejudices they would face, beyond anything the world might throw at them. The winter that followed would test their love in ways neither gunfights nor cavalry raids could match, proving that sometimes the greatest battles are fought in the quiet moments when you have to choose between the life you've always known and the life your heart demands. Sarah's labor began 3 weeks later, during the season the Apache called Ghostface, the deep winter when snow lay thick on the high mountains, and the world seemed locked in crystalline silence. She'd grown large with the baby, her body awkward and uncomfortable, but Naalnish had been infinitely patient, bringing her whatever she needed and never complaining about the restrictions her condition placed on their simple life. They'd moved to a more permanent shelter, a snug cave that Naalnish had improved with stone walls and a proper fire pit. Changing Woman had visited twice, bringing herbal medicines and practical advice, and several of the younger Apache women had made the dangerous winter journey to bring Sarah gifts for the baby. Soft blankets woven from rabbit fur, tiny moccasins decorated with intricate beadwork, wooden toys carved by loving hands. "The baby is ready to meet the world," Changing Woman announced after examining Sarah during her latest visit. "Soon now, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow." Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and terror at the old woman's words. She'd seen enough of frontier life to know that childbirth was dangerous under the best of circumstances, and her situation was far from ideal. But Changing Woman's confidence was reassuring, and Naalnish's steady presence gave her strength. When the pains began in earnest, just after sunset on a night when the aurora danced green and silver across the star-filled sky, Sarah understood why women called it labor. Each contraction felt like her body was trying to turn itself inside out, and the intensity took her breath away. "Walk," Changing Woman instructed, supporting Sarah's elbow as she paced back and forth across their small cave. "Movement helps baby find the right path." Naalnish hovered nearby, his usual calm competence replaced by obvious anxiety. He'd lost one wife in childbirth, and Sarah could see the fear in his eyes every time she gasped with pain. She wanted to comfort him, but the waves of sensation were too overwhelming for conversation. Hours passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Sarah lost track of time, aware only of Changing Woman's steady encouragement and Naalnish's warm presence. Sometimes he held her hands during the worst contractions, letting her squeeze until his fingers went white. Sometimes he simply sat nearby, singing soft Apache lullabies in his deep voice, the ancient melodies somehow soothing, despite the foreign words. "I can see the head," Changing Woman called out suddenly, her voice bright with excitement. "Push now, daughter. Your baby is almost here." With a final surge of effort that felt like it might split her in half, Sarah felt the child slip from her body in a rush of fluid and relief. The silence that followed lasted only a moment before a thin, angry cry filled the cave. "A daughter," Changing Woman announced, holding up the tiny wrinkled form. Strong lungs, like her mother. Sarah collapsed back against the fur blankets, exhausted but euphoric. Through the haze of fatigue, she watched Naalnish accept the baby from his grandmother with reverent hands, his dark eyes wide with wonder as he looked down at the new life. "She is beautiful," he murmured, bringing the bundle to Sarah. "Perfect." The baby was indeed perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a furious expression that reminded Sarah absurdly of herself when she was angry. The child had a dusting of dark hair and skin that was neither fully white nor fully Apache, but something entirely her own. "What will you call her?" Changing woman asked as she went about the ancient rituals of birth, cutting and tying the cord, cleaning mother and child, preparing the herbal teas that would help Sarah heal. Sarah looked down at her daughter's face, so small and serious, and felt an overwhelming rush of love unlike anything she'd ever experienced. This child was hers completely, born of love rather than duty, welcomed into the world by people who had chosen to accept them both. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope." Naalnish repeated the name in Apache, the syllables musical in his deep voice. "Hope," he said in English, testing the word. "Yes, she brings hope to us all." As the weeks passed and winter gradually loosened its grip on the mountains, Sarah settled into motherhood with a contentment she'd never expected. Hope was an easy baby, quick to smile and rarely fussing, except when hungry. Naalnish proved to be surprisingly good with her, holding her for hours while Sarah rested, teaching her Apache words she was far too young to understand, and generally acting like the devoted father she'd never dared hope her child would have. It was during one of these peaceful moments, Sarah nursing the baby while Naalnish prepared their evening meal, that they heard the sound of approaching horses. Sarah's blood went cold, memories of Thomas and his hired guns still fresh in her mind, but Naalnish's expression was calm as he listened. "Apache," he said, rising to peer out of the cave mouth. "My cousin and 2 others." The visitors brought news from the outside world, speaking rapidly in Apache while Sarah tried to parse their meaning from tone and gesture. Naalnish's face grew increasingly grim as he listened, and when the conversation ended and their guests had departed, he sat beside Sarah with troubled eyes. "What is it?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The cavalry captain who came looking for you has not given up. He has been asking questions in the settlements, offering rewards for information about your whereabouts. Some of the Apache have been questioned." Naalnish's jaw tightened. "He knows you are with us." Sarah felt fear settle in her stomach like a cold stone. She'd hoped Thomas's death would end the pursuit, but apparently others had taken up the hunt. "What does he want?" "Justice," he says, "claims you are being held against your will by hostile savages, that your child has been stolen from civilization." Naalnish's voice carried bitter irony. He does not seem to understand that a woman might choose to stay with Apache willingly. Sarah looked down at Hope, sleeping peacefully in her arms, and felt her resolve harden. This child had been born free, welcomed into a world where love mattered more than skin color or social position. She would not let anyone drag them back to a society that would label Hope a bastard and Sarah a whore. "Then we disappear," she said firmly. "Go somewhere he can't follow." Naalnish nodded slowly. "There are places deeper in the mountains, beyond the reach of cavalry horses. But it would mean leaving everything familiar behind, living as true outcasts, belonging fully to neither world." Sarah met his eyes steadily. "As long as we're together, I can live with that." He leaned over to kiss her forehead, then touched Hope's tiny hand with one gentle finger. "Then we leave at first light. But first," he paused, something shifting in his expression. "First, I would ask you something." Before Sarah could respond, Naalnish was on one knee beside their simple bed, his dark eyes serious and full of love. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not just in your heart, but in the way of my people. Let Hope have 2 parents who are truly joined, not just by necessity, but by choice." Sarah felt tears spill down her cheeks as she looked at this man who had given her everything: life, safety, love, and now a future for their daughter. The answer was easy. The Apache wedding ceremony took place just as the sun touched the eastern peaks, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of rose and gold that seemed to bless their union. Sarah wore a dress of soft buckskin decorated with turquoise beads that Changing Woman had brought as a wedding gift, and Naalnish had braided eagle feathers into his long hair as a symbol of the sacred commitment they were making. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. They stood together before Changing Woman, who spoke ancient words in Apache while the wind whispered through the canyon walls. Sarah understood little of the language, but she felt the power in the old woman's voice, the weight of tradition and blessing being called down upon them. When it came time for them to speak, Naalnish took Sarah's hands in his and looked deep in her eyes. "I promise to protect you and our daughter with my life," he said in English, his voice steady despite the emotions Sarah could see in his face. "To provide for you, to honor you, to love you until my last breath leaves my body." Sarah's own vows came from her heart rather than any ceremony she'd ever witnessed. "I promise to stand beside you no matter what challenges we face," she said, her voice strong and clear in the morning air. "To trust in your wisdom, to support your decisions, to love you and hope with everything I am." Changing Woman smiled and spoke a final blessing in Apache, then gestured for them to kiss. When Naalnish's lips met Sarah's, she felt something settle into place in her soul. A rightness, a completeness she'd never known existed. They left the canyon that same bent, riding north toward the deepest wilderness with hope bundled warmly between them. It would be a hard life, Sarah knew. They would face prejudice from both their peoples, isolation from the larger world, and the constant challenge of making a home in the wilderness. But as they rode through the pristine snow with their daughter secure in Naalnish's arms, Sarah felt a peace she'd never experienced in her former life of social expectations and material comfort. 2 years later, they had built a small cabin in a hidden valley where a warm spring kept the grass green year-round. Sarah had learned to tan hides and preserve meat, to identify medicinal plants and read weather signs. Her hands were no longer soft and white, but calloused and strong. Her face was bronzed by sun and wind, her body lean from the physical demands of frontier life. Hope was walking now, a sturdy toddler with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. She chattered in a mixture of English and Apache, equally comfortable with both languages and the worlds they represented. Watching her daughter play in the meadow where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, Sarah often marveled at the twist of fate that had brought them to this place. Changing Woman visited occasionally, bringing news of the outside world and gifts for hope. The last time she'd come, she'd brought word that the cavalry captain had finally given up his search, declaring Sarah and her child lost to the wilderness. The old woman had smiled as she delivered this news, knowing it meant true freedom for the little family she'd helped bring together. "He could not imagine that a white woman would choose our life over his," Changing Woman had observed with dry humor. "His blindness is our blessing." Sarah had learned many things during her years in the wilderness, but perhaps the most important was that home wasn't a place or a culture or a set of social expectations. Home was where you were loved unconditionally, where your children could grow up free from the prejudices that had nearly destroyed their mother, where your heart could rest without fear. As she sat on the porch of their cabin one evening, watching Naalnish teach Hope to identify animal tracks in the soft earth, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd lost everything she thought mattered: her reputation, her social position, her place in the civilized world. But she'd gained something infinitely more valuable. She'd found love, real love, the kind that risked everything and asked for nothing in return, the kind that built a life rather than just sharing one. Hope squealed with delight as she spotted rabbit tracks leading toward the stream, and Naalnish scooped her up in his arms, spinning her around until her laughter echoed off the canyon walls. Sarah watched them with a full heart, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family. The desert had nearly killed her, but it had also taught her the difference between surviving and truly living. In losing everything, she'd found everything that mattered, and she wouldn't change a single moment of the journey that had brought her home. If you enjoyed this incredible journey of love, survival, and finding home in the most unexpected places, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more amazing stories. Share in the comments which part moved you the most. I'd love to hear from you.